I'm now going to move to the last piece of the day, the last piece of the 3 days that we were together, and that's the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame inductions. For those of you who don't know Thinkers 50, it's best known for the biannual rankings of leading management thinkers. And I think they've performed a very, very useful contribution in helping us think about who's saying what and what's the nature of their influence. But they also have a Hall of Fame. That is, if you go to the website, you know, is the home to such management luminaries as Peter Drucker and Clayton Christensen, C.K. Prahalad, Ed Schein. I had lunch with Ed Schein a few months ago when I was like a giddy school kid. Ed Lawler, Tom Peters, Warren Bennis, Ikechiro, Professor Nonaka, and more. And you know, even reading these names now, you know, I'm filled with awe because when I was a graduate student, this transports me right back to those moments when these people were shaping the world that I hope to live in. They were my heroes. So the question is, who's going to join them this year? And Stuart Craner is here to give us insights into who they are and what they've done. I hope you'll stay and join us for this fitting end to 3 great days. Stuart, are you here?
I'm here, Bill. Thank you very much.
Oh, good to see you.
You've spent so long living in Switzerland. I should have expected punctuality, shouldn't I?
It's true.
So thank you for your kind introduction, Bill. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of the Thinkers 50. Thank you for joining us today for the final session of this year's event. And this is the session when we announce the new inductees into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. And the Hall of Fame, as Bill, the one name Bill didn't include was his own. Bill was inducted into the Hall of Fame in Shanghai last year. And we'd like to thank Hire for their support in making this happen and their commitment to collaboration and management ideas. In the story of Hire, Jiang Rui Min, at an early stage in the company's development, came across a battered second-hand copy of Peter Drucker's book, The Effective Executive. And Jiang Rui Min devoured it, and it informed his management style in the early years of Hire and proved influential in the development of the company. It's proof that ideas can make a difference and really build organizations. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, and take you through the background to the Hall of Fame and then introduce you to some of the new inductees for 2020. So our belief with the Hall of Fame is that knowledge builds over time and that knowledge is universal and opportunities for learning are universal. If you just look at Jugad innovation or frugal innovation as championed by Navi Raju in India, it's proof that there's opportunities for learning and improvement everywhere. It's not a function of wealth necessarily. And we also believe that no one culture, organization, individual, or nation has a monopoly on managerial wisdom. We heard earlier about regeneration, about unlearning and learning. And our belief has always been that we build on knowledge. And the Hall of Fame highlights the foundational knowledge which lies behind management and organizations. We also heard from Steve Denning talking about 21st century management. And there's a real sense now that we're kind of moving on, but we move on from somewhere. And the somewhere is the management ideas developed in the 19th, 20th century and earlier. And it's worth bearing in mind, I think, that management is timeless as well as universal. It took management to manage the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The pyramids, building the pyramids, took management, leadership, organizational understanding. So management has been going on for thousands of years. So the Hall of Fame celebrates a very global and eclectic and interesting group of thinkers who laid the foundations for today's management. As you look at them, you will notice they are dominated by Americans. America led the professionalization of management during the 20th century, so it's not a great surprise. It's also dominated unquestionably by men, and that's because it is historical. going forward, we expect that to change. And hats off to Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, who was the first woman to join the Hall of Fame for her stellar contribution to management thinking. But it's a very global group already. You see thinkers with Indian origins. C.K. Prahalad, the spokesman from Jaipur Rugs in the previous session, talked about CK's influence on that company. His book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid and Competing for the Future, really demonstrated how ideas can really shape the world. Other thinkers we feature with Indian origins are Namalia Kumar, Vijay Govindarajan and his work on innovation, Ram Charan and his work on executive coaching. There's Japanese thinkers like Kenichi Omai, who was talking about the impact of globalization and breaking down of national borders, kind of the best part of 40 years ago. Ikejiro Nanaka, talking about knowledge creation. There are a handful of Europeans in the Hall of Fame. Charles Handy from Britain, Herman Simon from Germany, Fons Trompenaar from Holland. What's interesting looking at this group is that their ideas are really relevant now. If you think about Bill Fisher's work on innovation, it really applies to the situation we're in now. If you think of Fons Trompenaar and his talk about the dilemmas posed by cross-cultural working, it's really relevant now. You think of Tom Peters. I mean, it was 1982 he wrote he co-authored In Search of Excellence. But at the heart of that book was getting close to customers. Over the last 2 days, we talked a lot about zero distance to customers. It echoes with Tom's thinking in 1982. So all of these thinkers have a resonance with the current situation, the current environment. Think of John Cotter from Harvard Business School, his work on change and transformation. So what's exciting today is we're going to induct 6 new thinkers into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. 4 contemporary thinkers and 2 important historical contributors. We will be joined by 2 of the inductees and experts on the work of one of the historical figures. So let's begin with the first inductee into the Hall of Fame this year. He is Richard Devaney. Richard is a compelling and original thinker. He's a professor at the Tufts School of Business. And there's an air of originality to all his behavior and all his work. I've always thought that if I was CEO of a corporation, heaven forbid, obviously, if I was a CEO, Richard Devaney is the guy I would bring in because he brings original thinking to every situation he encounters. Adrian Slywoski compared him to, said he was the Henry Kissinger of corporate strategy. And I've seen him compared to Sun Tzu, the Chinese thinker, elsewhere. And I think he is a combination of each of those. And Gary Hamel has celebrated the foresightedness of his books. If you look at Richard Devaney's books, Hyper Competition, which basically invented the term hyper competition and set the agenda for the 1990s. Thereafter, his lens got bigger with strategic supremacy, and then it became more concentrated as he looked at commoditization in beating the commodity trap. And then it got bigger again with strategic capitalism. He looked at the many types of capitalism emerging around the world. I think it's an underrated book, but really interesting. And most recently, Richard Devaney is the author of The Pan-Industrial Revolution. Really amazing book, mapping out the likely impact of 3D additive manufacturing and 3D printing on the realities of life. Again, a very agenda-setting book. We've got a video from Richard has been unwell over the last few months, and we send our best wishes to him. He sent us a video which is available on the Thinkers 50 website and will be circulating with social media. So he's our first inductee into the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame for 2020, Richard Devaney. The second inductee is Kathleen EISENHARDT. What's great about Kathy's work, we've always thought, is she bridges the gap between theory and practice. And at Thinkers 50, we've always believed in thinkers, academics, and consultants, whoever they are, who bridge that gap. We're not interested in esoteric research. We're interested in research that helps managers manage more effectively, more imaginatively, more creatively. There is nothing so practical as a great idea. And we think that Kathy Eisenhardt's work really proves that. She's a professor at Stanford and co-author of 2 books, Simple Rules, How to Survive in a Complex World, and Competing on the Edge, Strategy as Structured Chaos. Both of those books, I think, have really stood the test of time. And they've become, particularly Competing on the Edge, Strategy as Structured Chaos, I think it's actually become more appropriate and more timely as time has moved on. And in her book with Don Sull, it's really interesting. It's kind of the quest for simplicity, to make sense of management and organizations in ways which are practical and resonate with practitioners. We all know that great sports people and artists make things look simple. The best management thinkers do much the same. And I think that's what Kathy Eisenhardt's work really does. And there's a nice endorsement for her from Don Sull, again, which emphasizes the practical nature of her work. The next inductee into the 2020 Hall of Fame is a name that many people won't know about, Mary Parker Follett. In management history, as we will see in our conversation over the next few minutes, management history is full of important but neglected voices. And Mary Parker Follett is one of them. Before the Hawthorne experiments in the 1930s, before Douglas McGregor in the 1950s, she charted a humane way forward for managers and leaders. She was an antidote to Henry Ford and Frederick Taylor's scientific management. Look at the times she was writing, 1918, 1924. These were prehistoric days in terms of management. Scientific management held sway. The world of human resources, talent management, and the like owes a great deal to the foundational insights of Mary Parker Follett. She argued that people were central to any business activity. Obvious now in many ways, but people weren't saying that at the time. She also looked at conflict as a fact of life and something we had to manage through integration. And she also talked about the notion of reciprocal leadership. There's a lot of, it sounds very modern, her notion of leadership, reciprocal leadership. I think it's an idea that has transcended her time. And she was an early advocate of management training and argued that leadership could be taught. It's interesting that in Japan, there was a Follett society. The Japanese, again, embraced Mary Parker Follett's ideas in the way that people in the West did not. The next inductee into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame for 2020 is Charles Clinton Spaulding, C.C. Spaulding. A few months ago, probably at the beginning of the year, Tiffany Bover of Salesforce sent me a link to an article written by Lila McClellan in Quartz, on the website Quartz. And it was largely about C.C. Spaulding and his work. And I'd never heard of him. I actually wrote a book on the history of management in the 20th century. And reading about him, I thought, how could I have missed him? How could I know nothing about him? The reason I knew nothing about it is because he was an African-American business leader. And the history of management has been largely looked through a white lens. But his career was amazing. He ran the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company for over 50 years, became America's largest black-owned business. So he was a practitioner. But what's really interesting, I think, about Spaulding is that his ideas were relevant now, or are relevant now. He championed cooperation. And it's incredibly relevant now, I think. Looking at Spaulding, I learned that a book had been written about African-American management history. And to shed light on Spaulding's importance, and other thinkers we should be paying attention, and why he justifies a place in the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame. I'm really delighted that we've got with us today Leon Prieto and Simone Phipps, who are co-authors of a book called African American Management History. Leon is a professor at Clayton State University and an associate research fellow at Cambridge Judge Business School. And Simone is a professor at Middle Georgia State University. Hopefully I've stopped sharing now. Leon and Simone, welcome. Very, very nice of you to join us.
Thank you for inviting us.
How did you come across Spaulding in the first place?
Hello, thank you. Well, we were doing some research on what we now know as hidden figures or overlooked figures in management history, and we realized that the black figures were noticeably missing. And we knew that it wasn't that they didn't contribute, but they were just overlooked. And so we started doing some research to explore who some of these figures may be. And one of them that we stumbled across was Charles Clinton Spaulding.
And what interested you about him then? I mean, what struck me was there's not many practitioners who have actually articulated ideas about management, which always amazes me that they haven't really thought it through. But Spaulding was writing, articulated a kind of theory of management based on cooperation before Henri Fayol's book was published in English. So he was actually ahead of his time. But so what ignited your interest, Leon?
Well, what ignited our interest was how relevant his writings are today, because right now capitalism is being critiqued, so what really piqued our interest is the fact that we can actually learn from Spaulding and his writings and his management practice and thought leadership to try to reimagine what capitalism can be today, because he adopted a more compassionate and communitarian approach to capitalism. And we make the argument that his company, the North Carolina Mutual, they gained a cooperative advantage based on the adherence to a spirit of care and community, consensus building and dialogue they had with the community. So he played a very powerful role in making a difference within the African American community. And some of you all probably heard of Black Wall Street. Is getting more popular today. So he was a pioneer in Black Wall Street. So when Simon and I uncovered some of his writings a little over 6 years ago, we were just struck by, his brilliance, his business acumen, and the fact that how come he's not in the textbooks?
He is now. What's interesting as well, it was a big business. It had assets of over $40 million. The North Carolina Mutual, the one he ran. What about tell us more about cooperative advantage? What it meant for Spaulding and what it means now, Simone?
Well, cooperative advantage, we define it as the benefits that an organization can accrue and gain and accrue really by having a people-oriented, people-centric approach that really based on tenets of African tradition called Ubuntu, which can mean I am because we are. So it's that idea of communitarianism and collective spirit. And those tenets include spirituality, which doesn't have to be based on religion, but really caring about people's well-being. And also consensus building and dialogue. So you can get that advantage and benefit from cooperation. And so Spaulding did benefit from that cooperative advantage because it wasn't just about efficiency and profits for him. Yes, that was important. He was a practical business person. And from his principles of management, his fundamental necessities of management that he wrote about, you can see he was a practical business person. But he also really cared about people, and he believed in democratic decision making, so people were able to give their opinions, etc. So he was very people oriented in his values, and he was able to benefit from that. And so he gave to his employees and the community at large, and they gave back to the organization in terms of their support. So he benefited from that cooperative advantage. And today, organizations can do the same. They can have that cooperative advantage by thinking about their stakeholders and not just the bottom line. So if they care about their employees, making sure they have meaningful work, making sure they care about development, employee development, and things like that, making sure employees have a voice so that they can give their opinions and know that they'll be listened to and taken seriously. That's important. And to care about the community as well, and to care about the needs of the community and fulfill those needs.
I think what's interesting as well, he's the first African American in the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame, but he's also the first practitioner. And it's very rare for practitioners to articulate their values and their management style so clearly. Who else did you uncover in your research, Leon? Who else should we be paying attention to from the African American business leadership community?
One person we should be paying attention to is also Maggie Lena Walker, and she's known as the first African American woman who founded and started her own bank. And she did this in the very early 20th century. And the name of the bank is called the St. Luke Savings Penny Bank. And it was groundbreaking in the fact that it provided a lot of loans for African Americans to purchase homes, start businesses. And this was located in Richmond, Virginia. And she gave these amazing speeches, and she encouraged women to play a role in getting themselves into professions. And she played a very prominent role in trying to end racial injustice within Richmond, Virginia, and the entire United States by extension. So she wasn't just a business pioneer, but I would also argue that she was a social innovator within the African American community. And we can all learn from some of her meaningful contributions, especially in this point in time, especially in the United States and other parts in the world where there are instances of racial injustices. So she is a pioneer that deserves a lot of attention.
There's also a sense, which Simone, I think, alluded to, that there's entire traditions and approaches to management that we in the West remain largely ignorant of. We've encountered Japanese management in the 1980s. And I think one of the interesting elements with hire and its then high philosophy of management, a kind of a Chinese perspective on management. I mean, the Chinese have been managing for thousands of years in the same way other continents have. But there's also an African tradition of management and understanding of how management works isn't really understood in amongst in the West. Do you think that will be uncovered?
Well, we definitely hope so. This is the starting point for it to be uncovered, because those African traditions have been going on for a very long time. And with slavery, when Africans were brought to the New World, those traditions came with them. And they practiced those traditions, and those traditions also seeped into business practice. And so we really hoping that those can be, I want to say, rediscovered and made more prominent so more people know about it. So in the book, we focus a lot on that tradition of Ubuntu, as I said, but of course there are going to be more African traditions as well that we would like to be brought to the fore.
And where does your research go next, Leon?
Well, some of the research will focus on other pioneers of African descent who played a role in different forms of businesses. So Simon and I also have an interest in cooperative economics. So there are some unsung heroes of African descent who played a role in starting cooperative businesses. And cooperatives, as we all know, is a more democratic form of entrepreneurship. And it allows people, disenfranchised people, to get access to capital, and the failure rate is much lower in cooperatives. So we are uncovering a lot of interesting um, work from African Americans and other people of color within that cooperative movement, and how they are charting their course towards business success and making a positive impact in their communities as well.
Yeah, in Europe, there's a big tradition of cooperatives as well, which is they're still significant, but generally overlooked often. So where should, I'm sure we've piqued a lot of people's interest in the work of Spaulding. I mean, obviously people should rush out and buy your book, African American Management History. But where else can they look? Where else should people look to learn more about Spaulding?
Well, in terms of learning about Spaulding, there's there's one other book written about his company, the North Carolina Mutual. It was written by a gentleman by the name of Ware. The name of the book escapes me right now, but I can always share that information with you later on. But he's very well known within North Carolina. See, there are a number of articles and all these things written about him. But in our book, African American Management History, we focus more so on his management thought leadership, which we thought was actually quite special and informative to us now. And my students often get very surprised that there's actually someone that looks like them that actually contributed to business management thinking, because I work for a predominantly Black institution. And when I attended a historically Black institution myself as an undergraduate student, I was quite surprised that there were no contributors to management thinking that were listed from India, from Africa, from China. And so when Simon and I were in our doctoral program together at Louisiana State University, we took a class in management history, and there was nothing about the pioneers from Africa and India and China. And we felt, it's our turn to make that contribution as scholars and illuminate the world about some of these pioneers. So I'm happy you mentioned the research out of India with Jugaad and frugal innovation. And there are other types of innovation that is similar to Jugaad that's taking place in other parts of the world. Like in Kenya, there's Jua Kali, which is very similar to Jugaad. It's a form of frugal innovation. So it'll be interesting for us to look for other types of theories as it relates to innovation and management thinking within subaltern populations.
Yeah, Leon and Simone, thank you very much for joining us. I think what the lesson from Spaulding and from your work is that we have to open our eyes to the best practice and useful and insightful ideas, no matter where they are. And I think the way forward for all organizations must be to embrace great ideas, no matter where they come from. And thank you for your contribution. So C.C. Spaulding, check him out. I would Google, well, obviously you're going to buy Leon and Simone's book, but Lila McClellan's article in Quartz is worth Googling as a starting point for Spaulding's work. So So far, we've inducted Richard Devaney from Tuck Business School, creator of Hyper Competition, Kathleen EISENHARDT from Stanford, Mary Parker Follett for her work in championing humane style of management, and Charles Clinton Spaulding for his work as a practitioner, but also for his ability to create a philosophy around cooperative advantage, which I think is times that actually never been needed more. And now we move on to the fifth person we're going to induct into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame in 2020. His name is David Teese. David is an intriguing blend of academic, consultant, and entrepreneur. He's the Thomas W. Tuscher Professor in Global Business and Director of the Tuscher Institute for the Management of Intellectual Capital at the University of California's Berkeley Haas School of Business, and he's co-founder of the Berkeley Research Group. David, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear, David. Very nice.
Good.
Very nice of you to join us, and congratulations on joining this august group. You're the first person from New Zealand to join the group.
Oh, I'm sure there'll be more.
Growing up in New Zealand, most New Zealand children want to play for the All Blacks. How did you get interested in the world of organisations and management?
Well, basically because I was interested in two related things. One is the competitive advantage of nations. And over time, I come to understand that depended importantly on the competitive advantage of individual firms. So I was never sure whether I wanted to be a practitioner or something different. Anyway, I went to the Wharton School for my PhD and ended up focusing on the business firm and technological innovation. And then straddling practice and theory for my entire career.
What's the golden thread that goes through your thinking, do you think?
The golden thread is some form of entrepreneurial thinking, a mindset of the need to change, the need to embrace opportunity, while at the same time manage the day-to-day business. Recognizing that there's deep uncertainty everywhere, and of course with globalization, deep uncertainty went up. But being able to manage in a world of deep uncertainty where you really can't plan the future, but you have to both adapt to it and shape it. There's obviously a big school about adaptation. There's a big school about entrepreneurship. But no one had really brought those two sets of ideas together, and that's what led to my concept of dynamic capabilities.
That's probably the Teese model, and the dynamic capabilities is what you're best known for. Can you tell us about how the idea, the concept of the dynamic capabilities evolved in your work?
Well, you mentioned what is some people call the Teese model, which was about how come so many of the pioneers in innovation end up not being significant in the market. And that was actually informed a lot, Stuart, by the British experience that I was aware of as a young person growing up in New Zealand. The tremendous contributions that Great Britain had made to technology, commercial aircraft, CAD scanners, hovercraft, atomic energy. The British were incredibly good at inventing and doing early stage research, but rather poor at capitalizing on that in the marketplace. And then I saw a similar thing happen in the United States with the rise of Japan. So I started systematically studying what is it, not just about public policy, but what is it about management that can lead to these situations. And, what I found out there, Stuart, is a heck of a lot of good ideas in management, as you can see from all the people in your Hall of Fame. But very few people focus on trying to pull all of those ideas together into a coherent structure. And maybe there'll never be a general theory of management because it's very situational. But I think there are many common threads and a lot of the great ideas that, in fact, your people that you've acknowledged in the Hall of Fame have created. And so part of what I've tried to do is knit those ideas together into, I'll call it a workable systems theory of management for environments of rapid change. And that's where dynamic capabilities come from.
And what was people's response when you first came up with the idea of dynamic capabilities? Because I think the concepts you're talking about now, uncertainty, etc., are actually accepted now. But 10 years ago, 20 years ago, uncertainty, ambiguity, and change were not embraced so wholeheartedly by people in the business world.
I think early on, it was hard for people to understand what I was trying to say, and people were very much intrigued by it. But in fact, the early paper on dynamic capabilities sat around for 5 or 6 or 7 years before I published it because I thought it was incomplete. And it remains incomplete, even though it's been published and I've built on it a lot. I think what's happened over time is that people have come to understand that innovation is really the fundamental driver of competition and competitive advantage, whether it's technological innovation or business model innovation or management innovation, as you were talking about with hire. And so I think over time there's been a greater acceptance of it. Also I started talking about what I call ordinary capabilities. In fact, maybe Sid Winter put that idea down first. I started talking about what dynamic capabilities are not in order to get across what they are. So ordinary capabilities is a lot about best practices, being efficient, all the things that the economics textbooks emphasize in the context of productivity improvement at the firm and the national level. And then once I got that distinction going, people started to understand better dynamic capabilities by talking about what it's not. But it actually takes a broad set of experiences and a broad understanding of a lot of literature to be able to really deeply grasp what dynamic capabilities are all about. And certainly I've tried to simplify it around this concept of sensing, seizing, and transforming. But that's really just a reduced form of a much more complicated model. But the world is awfully complicated, and obviously there's a benefit in simplifying, but you shouldn't simplify too much.
But that's the temptation of most business writing, isn't it?
Yes, in fact, it was maybe it was Einstein that once said, you should try and make things as simple as possible, but no simpler than they can be.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting about your career is that you're very intent on putting ideas into practice. You're both reflective and somebody who actually does things. I mean, you're involved in a variety of entrepreneurial ventures. How do those things work together? Did you do that automatically from the start, or is it something you acquired along the way?
It's something that came along the way, but I can tell you that as I approached management and started thinking about building firms, it really helped to understand the history of management and management thinking. And I can tell you, it gave me a lot of confidence to do things differently. I mean, most people, when they build a business, they kind of build it pretty much the same way other people do, unless you're an out-of-the-box thinker. And there's, like an Elon Musk or a Steve Jobs. And there's different ways that you can get to think out of the box. And one way is when you know what's already written, then, you can understand where the gaps are and where there's an opportunity to innovate, where maybe you can go beyond where someone has been before. And perhaps I'm the only one that sort of innovated in management that way, by actually leveraging off the management literature itself. And with the company I've got right now, the Berkeley Research Group, it's very much a decentralized entrepreneurial company. It's relatively small. We're only about 1,200-1,300 people, but it is scaling very nicely and using principles, actually, many of them similar to the hire model. But the elements of these different models all of them have got long history in management thought. But there's ways to pull them together in new and interesting ways. And if you know the literature, it gives you confidence to act and to explain to others what it is you're doing. Although, even if others don't understand, if they think you know what you're doing, they'll give you the license to proceed, which is mainly what you're looking for.
So what gets you out of bed in the morning now? I mean, you've got a great entrepreneurial record. You've had a big influence on management thinking. You're still doing this. What's motivating you now?
It's a very good question. What's motivating me now is to continue to bring these ideas not just into management, but also into public policy. Management thinking really has not impacted public policy. In fact, most public policy, except for maybe governance, doesn't rely on anything from the management literature. For instance, competition policy, we have this big debate around big tech and what to do about big tech. And all of the so-called experts that are rushing forward with solutions don't know a thing or don't have anything in their background or any evidence from what they write that they really understand management theory. Nicholas Bloom in the UK has published a number of papers now in economics saying that management matters, which of course is not a surprise to anybody that's in the management field. But the fact is that a lot of fields of the social sciences proceed without any understanding of management. And I don't understand how you can do high quality competition policy without understanding the role of management. And so I have this idea about what I call dynamic competition that rests in part on dynamic capabilities. And my view is that competition policy or antitrust policy, whatever you want to call it, should be informed by dynamic competition. And the goal should be to improve dynamic competition as a process and not what I call static competition. So that's one set of ideas. The other set of ideas is, and I'm trying to work with the Gibbs Business School in Pretoria around this, bringing management thinking and ideas to economic development. John Sutton from the London Business School has said that the economic or the wealth of nations depends on the capabilities of firms. I think everybody on this call would probably agree, but there's almost no literature on it. So once again, I'm trying to fill the gaps and bring management theory to economic development. So in addition to running a company, the Berkeley Research Group, and continuing to build it through difficult times, I'm very active in research and outreach, and to some extent in the startup world as well.
So there's new frontiers for management. So the new frontiers, government and economic development, where it's been largely ignored.
I would like to think so, but of course it places a burden on management scholars too. You've got to bone up and learn about those different contexts, and this is very, very hard. So what keeps me up is you've got to sit on top of many, many literatures in the social sciences and many, many facts about particular industries and regulations to be able to contribute in meaningful ways with these conversations. So there's just a lot to do if you try and take on big ideas and apply big ideas. It's always easy to take a narrow rifle shot view and bring specialized expertise to a particular, narrow question, or maybe even sometimes a big question, but to really understand different perspectives in the social sciences and bring the benefits of research forward under complex problems, that's a challenge of a different order of magnitude.
Are you optimistic?
I see progress is being made. The old story, don't waste a crisis. When there's a crisis, people tend to open their minds to new thinking. So I think it is a good time to get some new perspectives launched. I'm certainly giving it a try with competition policy right now and with economic development. So yes, I think it is a good time.
David, congratulations again on joining the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame. Thank you for joining us today. To find out more information about David's work, look at the Berkeley Research Group website, and I see there's quite a lot of comments coming in, David. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And so to the final person being inducted into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame for 2020. I should point out that we're inducting people in alphabetical order, so it's not, there's no preference. So far, we've inducted Richard Devaney from the Tuck School, creator of Hyper Competition. Kathy EISENHART. I saw there was lots of comments about Kathy's work. Mary Parker Follett for her humane take on management in a very inhumane scientific age. Charles Clinton Spaulding for his amazing work in creating a coherent philosophy of management while still being a hugely successful and pioneering practitioner. And David Teese for his work around dynamic capabilities and much more, for bridging the divide between research and practice. And finally, well, not finally, we come to George Yip. He's the final person to be inducted into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame for 2020. George is somebody we've known for a couple of decades now, somebody who's truly global in their life and their perspectives on all aspects of business. George has held senior roles at the China Europe International Business School, Rotterdam School of Management, Cambridge Judge School, London Business School, and the UK's Advanced Institute of Management Research. And he's now Emeritus Professor of Marketing and Strategy at Imperial College Business School, where he's also Associate Dean for Executive Programs. George, thank you for joining us. You're joining us from America today. How did you get here? Tell us how you got here, because your story is amazingly global in itself. Tell us more.
Well, I started in Hong Kong, and most of my family moved to England at the age of 10. So I had my education there, went to Cambridge University, and worked for Unilever in consumer marketing for the first 4 years of my career. And then I decided to get an MBA, which is what got me to Harvard Business School, and from there to, in fact, I did the first year of the MBA at Cranfield and then transferred to the second year at Harvard. But on my first day in class at Cranfield, I thought I really want to be on the other side of the classroom. So I sort of got the teaching bug immediately. I tried to resist it, actually, but
they all try.
But eventually I decided to get a doctorate, and my great interest was strategy. And I think it comes from my school-age great interest in a combination of history and military strategy. So when I came across business strategy, I thought, wow, this is my subject. I absolutely love it. And in fact, you inviting me to think about the golden thread made me realize that I like to look at a systematic strategic response to context. And that really comes from the history and the interest in military matters. So initially I was interested in industry as a context, and I was lucky to, when I was an MBA student at Harvard, when I was looking around who can be my supervisor for my doctorate, and I came across an unknown associate professor who was applying industrial organization economics to strategy in a systematic way, whereas the traditional Harvard Business School approach was that everything is different and every situation is different. So really against trying to come up with systematic rules. This person was Michael Porter. I was even advised against studying under him because companies didn't practice what he was promoting, but in fact, he was promoting next practice rather than best practice, and that's what I was interested in as well. So I was very fortunate that he took me on as his second doctoral student, and indeed, my dissertation was on one of his 5 forces, barriers to entry, while he was writing his first book, Competitive Strategy. Do you want me to say more?
Yes. So what happened with Michael Porter? Did he do anything with his career?
Oh, he did quite well. He became one of your inductees, and is perhaps one of the most famous professors ever.
Yeah, so that was a happy piece of luck to kick things off. You talked.
Yes, I don't really like to emphasize I've had a lot of luck in my career. So that was the first piece of luck. However, that got me onto the faculty at Harvard Business School. But after 3 years, I lost interest in an academic career because this work on barriers to entry, I realize now, was a bit too academic for me, and it was most academics do their work at the frontier of theory, and I wasn't particularly interested in that. I made a contribution as a frontier of theory with barriers to entry by coming up with the concept of gateways to entry. But I much prefer to work at the frontiers of practice. And looking back, I realized that my career has really focused on topics that are the frontier of practice. So I went into management consulting in big firms for 4 years. And while I was working on one study, which actually I helped to sell and to manage, which was looking at the global organization problems of one of the world's largest communications equipment companies, I came across this problem where a very important division of the company could not get things done around the world because the company was organized in such a decentralized kind of way with separate international divisions, separate product divisions, not globally integrated. And at that time, in the late 80s, people like Porter and Prahalad and others were starting to, and Kenichi Omai, were starting to write about the need for global integration. I suddenly thought, this is what I'm really interested in. And in fact, I left the consulting world at a big risk to take a visiting professorship at Georgetown University at a fraction of the pay to write a book about global strategy. And my idea was to take, again, a systematic approach with a 3-part framework, which was, first of all, a set of about 21 industry globalization drivers organized around market drivers, cost, government, and competitive drivers, but then linking that to a set of 5 global strategy levers: market participation, global product policy, activity location, global marketing, and global competitive moves. But the key point was that I recommended that companies select their global strategy levers on a contingent basis based on the nature of the industry that they were in. So, for example, a company, an automobile company, would need a much more globally integrated and standardized strategy than a multinational food company. But those 2 elements were not enough in themselves. I added a third element of organization, because obviously strategy is implemented through the organization, and even more so when you look at global strategy. So the framework for organization, again, had about 20 elements in 4 parts of organization structure, management processes, people, and culture. So I put together this integrated systematic approach in a book called Total Global Strategy that came out in 1992 that was very successful. And again, the piece of luck was that to come out with globalization in the 1990s, when this was what everyone was interested in, so people really picked up on this book, including my favorite memory being a street vendor in Mexico City. One of my colleagues, Jose de la Torre, saw a street vendor selling the Spanish version of my book, Globalización. He obviously knew nothing about it. He was selling it purely based on the title. So that was a piece of luck as well.
I mean, you've produced a lot of books over the years: Pioneers, Hidden Champions, Changemakers, and Underdogs: Lessons from China's Innovators, 2019 book, and you focused on China quite a lot in your recent research, and you spent time at SEABS in China. What's your take on where China is now in its competitive evolution?
Oh, I mean, China is continuing to grow tremendously. It's now been over 40 years since China started its liberalization in 1978. And as the subtitle of my first book on China, the book's called China's Next Strategic Advantage: From Imitation to Innovation. So China has very much moved toward innovation. The Chinese government has innovation really as its #1 priority. And interestingly, Chinese companies are innovating in their own Chinese way. First of all, it is initially based on their manufacturing advantage. So they are innovating in the categories that are also manufacturing intensive. And I'm just working on a paper citing DJI, the drone maker, as a classic example of that, where drones are a manufacturing intensive product, not high technology, but moderate technology, and where innovations really mean adding features, like adding more rotors, making it bigger, smaller, carrying people, making it fully robotic, etc. And that really meshes well with the kind of innovation that they're doing. But in our research, we also found that China's now got the conditions on the supply side for innovation. So one, it's got the manufacturing, capability, which, for example, India mostly doesn't have. It has now huge numbers of scientists and engineers, not as good quality as in the West, but they're bringing back ethnic Chinese who got their PhDs from Stanford, MIT, and Cambridge. And they're bringing back to China, and they're giving them large pyramids of scientists and engineers. And another difference with Chinese management is that they move very quickly. So our research found that Western companies now have over-elaborate innovation processes because they're afraid of making mistakes. In a sense, in China, the biggest mistake is to move so slowly. So again and again, we heard from the Western companies in China that their processes were too slow and the Chinese ones were much quicker. So the Chinese believe in failing fast, implementing very quickly. So while the West may be good at going from 0 to 1, the Chinese are very good at going from 1 to 100.
Your recent work also talks about organizational intelligence, which is a fantastic concept. It's something you don't meet every day.
I found it quite strange in my career that I started in industrial organization economics, where we totally ignored organization. And then I moved into strategic transformation, looking at organization. And now I've moved to leadership. And that really came out from having done research on strategic transformation in the 2000s and becoming both the Associate Dean for the MBA program at London Business School and then the Dean at Rotterdam School of Management, where I had to conduct strategic transformation. And I realized that at Rotterdam, my advantage wasn't that I had a higher IQ than the other faculty because, you know, faculty are very smart. I didn't have the highest emotional quotient, the highest EQ. My EQ was good enough, but I often find that people with the highest EQ are not that good leaders because they experience the pain of others too much. You have to be willing to inflict some pain to be a leader. What I realized my advantage was, in addition to probably knowing more about business schools than anybody else there, because I've been to so many different business schools, and I knew how to take a contingent view of what was right for the school. So, you know, the strategy for Harvard is not the right strategy for Rotterdam, nor the strategy for London Business School, etc. I realized that what I had was organizational intelligence, which is knowing how to get the organization to do things for you. If you think about leading an organization of hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands of people, the leader can do very little. You have to get other people to do it. And some specific concepts that we developed were that sending messages that reinforce the strategy. So I made judicious use of email. I give you a specific example. I wanted faculty to publish more in practitioner journals like Harvard Business Review, in addition to the academic ones. And I put in various programs to do that. So when people finally started publishing in HBR or Sloan, I actually sent out an email to the whole school congratulating them. But when someone published as usual in an academic journal, no email. This was actually unpopular because most people were publishing most of the time in academic journals. But the leader has to be willing to send unpopular messages that reinforce the strategy that they are promoting. I also pushed action strategy because I had a 4-year contract, and particularly in academic culture and Dutch culture, which people love to discuss. I could have talked for 4 years about change. Instead, I started action strategies, different initiatives, and then created a coalition of the willing. In fact, only after 2.5 years did I have the strategic discussion with the senior leaders of the school. By then, they'd seen through the action programs that this could be done, such as raising money from companies, and engaging with them in starting up research centers and so on. So, and so I followed the marketing concept of attitude follows action. So after I finished being dean, I wrote an article about what I did. And later on, I developed this idea of organizational intelligence. And we recently, with a co-author at Imperial, Nelson Phillips, published an article in Harvard Business Review about organizational intelligence. So I now talk about that OQ is more important than IQ or EQ for leaders.
George, we could talk all day. We can't because Bill's Swiss timekeeping will call time we're in the final minute. I think the lesson from George Yip and from some of the other practitioners the challenge is to be at the frontier of practice. The frontier of thinking is nothing without the frontier of practice. So today we've inducted into the Thinkers50 Hall of Fame Richard Devaney, Kathy EISENHARDT, Mary Parker Follett, Charles Clinton Spaulding, David Teese, and George Yip. Congratulations to all of them. I would encourage everyone watching to seek out their work and ideas. You might not agree with it. It might not accord with your current situation, but will make you think. So thank you to everybody who's joined us today. And thank you to Bill for your sturdy work as our host.